Hello and welcome back to Film on High Reviews. I'm Alex.
This is Deca.
And today we're going to be talking about the 1997 film Henry Fool, directed by Hal Hartley, Thomas J. Ryan, James Urbaniak, Parker Posey, Kevin Corrigan, and Liam Aiken. The film tells the story of Simon Grimm, a somewhat repressed and socially awkward young man with a menial job who lives with his mother and sister, and whose world is irrevocably shaken when he meets a charismatic and intelligent roguish man by the name of Henry Fool, who arrives to take up residence in the basement below the family's home. Henry, a verbose ex-con who considers himself a writer, encourages Simon to start expressing himself through writing poetry, but the two men find their friendship tested as Simon's poetry begins to have a very strange and outsized impact on the community around him. So, what did you think of Henry Fool?
Well, okay. This is a difficult movie to unpack. There's a lot of layers. There's a lot of tones being displayed to us, and the more you watch the film, the more you find out about the characters, the more complex it becomes, just because in its core this movie is just telling a very human story. And in anything, honestly, that's one thing to really, it's hard to master something like that and to be able to display it in the succinct way where it's simple, digestible, but at the same time it makes you really ponder on the actual question of, like, what is an artist, what is a writer, and what is defined as good writing, if I could say so.
Yeah, this is a very kind of strange and unique film, maybe one of the most unique films I've ever seen, and it comes from a time where independent film, really meant something. It was a very kind of fertile and promising time, that kind of, 90s period before everything got sort of commodified and stuff like that. And Hal Hartley was kind of at the vanguard of this movement, the kind of new independent film movement. He's a filmmaker that's not super well known, especially compared to his contemporaries, but he did inspire a lot of filmmakers, and he had this style where he was making weird, offbeat, quirky movies that were very much dialogue heavy. He was particularly an inspiration to guys like Kevin Smith and stuff like that. And maybe part of the reason he's not as well known as some of the other people from that era is because he never, really compromised himself. His films are definitely an acquired taste, and they're not going to be for everyone, but you can tell that he's a filmmaker that was always, about his own kind of vision, and he didn't necessarily try to make, that jump into the mainstream like so many others did, and that sort of reflects the themes of the film in a lot of ways as well. And it's a really fascinating look at, it's just such a strange idea.
Mm-hmm.
I guess you could say that there have been movies like this before, kind of buddy movies in a way, movies about friendship, movies about artists and how they kind of inspire each other. But the movie takes a particular kind of unique style at being it's very much about these kind of low end of society people. We see Simon at the beginning, he's very much almost like a victim in some sense. His position in life is very on the low end of the totem pole. He's not treated well by his family, he's bullied by people in his neighborhood. He has his job as a garbage man, and his sister doesn't work, and his mother is ill and needs to be medicated, so neither of them are kind of capable of contributing, so it all falls onto him to do this. So Like, he's almost like this Kafka-esque sort of character. Like, this guy who's very self-sacrificing, but also very kind of, treated poorly by everyone around him.
Mm-hmm.
And then when Henry shows up, like, for one thing, these two guys are so different. Like, it's very much kind of a contrasting story between these two guys who they shouldn't get along. Like, they're just so different, but there's this connection. And, maybe it's the classical thing of the two being sort of outcasts. But right from the beginning, you can sort of tell, like, the movie does a good job with that, where Henry's arrival, like, it's treated as this big thing where, you see, like, Simon hears him coming from a distance, and he's, like, getting on the ground and putting his head to the concrete as if, like, it's a massive giant that's coming that can be heard from miles away. Mm. And that's kind of like, foreshadowing the impact that Henry's going to have in his life. And Henry maybe sees something in Simon. And, there's like, on one hand, like, Henry, like I said, he's the complete opposite of Simon. He's grandiose. He's very florid, almost pretentious, the way he talks. He has this really over-the-top way of talking, but he's definitely like an interesting guy. He's especially like for someone like Simon who's really sort of closed off. And yeah, he starts talking about all this stuff. He tells Simon about like, he's a writer and he's writing this grand confession, which is like his memoir, and he's so convinced that once it gets published, the world is going to be overwhelmed and it's going to just change everything. So, there's a great deal of arrogance there. And on top of that, as the movie continues, we find out increasingly sort of dark and disturbing details about Henry as a character.
Yeah.
And yeah, like, that's kind of where the challenge comes in. Like, Henry, at first, he seems like this somewhat glib, but, fairly likable guy. You're drawn into his energy, but we find out that he's compulsive. He has these kind of violent compulsions, these sexual compulsions. He's a substance abuser and, heavy drinker. And we find out that he was in prison. And not only that, he was in prison for something very, like, imprisoned basically for
statutory rape.
Yeah, to put it so boldly. Like, I was going to try to maybe reframe it in a way that was a little bit more YouTube friendly.
There's no skirting around it.
Yeah, he was involved in something with a minor, and, that's very bad. Like, that's one of the worst crimes a person can commit. So it's sort of throwing down the gauntlet with this guy. He's a very complex character, and, you could write him off as like a scoundrel, a scumbag, like this kind of lowlife, but there's a bit more to him. And, like, the movie has like a small cast of characters relatively. Like, obviously a lot of the focus is on Simon and Henry and this relationship that they have, but we also get a lot on Simon's sister Faye and how she kind of gets involved in this too. She's kind of pulled into their world as well. And obviously Simon's mother, Mary, who's kind of suffering from her own malaise and discontent. Like, she's an interesting character because we don't get like a lot of detail on her, but we get just enough to sort of like, make assumptions about what her issues may be. And we also get kind of a portrait of the neighborhood, particularly Mr. Deng and his daughter Nok, who run the kind of they run this like local coffee shop. And there's also a character named Warren, played by Kevin Corrigan, who's kind of the local punk. Like, we see him at the beginning, he's sort of picking on Simon and treating him very roughly. And he seems like kind of a minor throwaway character, but even he sort of has like an evolution throughout the film. Like, the movie kind of shows how this whole community is like affected and how all these people are sort of connected. And they do sort of go through changes in some ways. And the movie, even though it was made in 1997, it has this broad sweep, and it was rather like forward thinking in terms of things like the internet and how that would completely change the way media and information is transmitted, and things like politics, and like it has like an interesting perspective to give on a lot of these matters. And all of these characters, and they have their own kind of sense of depth and their own little idiosyncrasies that make them stand out. So even though like it's a relatively small film, it's packed with ideas and packed with a lot of like really interesting nuances.
And the way that those ideas are portrayed in this film is they're very carefully tailored in a way where They're not trying to jam it down your throat like a lot of movies that try to make a poignant point of like, oh, you need to get this, so we're gonna bash it down through your head. It's like, no, they trust the audience to understand what is going on with these characters. And speaking of the characters, Henry and Simon, Henry is the storm, whilst the neighborhood itself is just that little village that, has gone stagnant, essentially, the living dead type of shit. So with Henry, as you mentioned, being boisterous, being bold, and kind of coaxing Simon out of his shell, basically, to stand up for himself, to see kind of the beauty of the world, even if it's mired with shit and all that type of stuff. It's kind of good because it kind of shows a real transition of like how it is to become friends to eventually brothers and so on and so forth. Of it always starts small. Somebody that just kind of looks at you and basically kind of props you up because they can see something in you, even though you don't believe it in yourself. But over time, that kind of effect will kind of change you somewhat bit by bit. And that's what I like about the film. It's like, it's not just like, okay, now we're at the second act, Simon is like a whole new different person and this is going on. It's like, no, you get it through peppering through some scenes where it's like it needs to be there. And there are some really shocking scenes in this film where you're like, whoa, and it just comes out of nowhere, but it comes when you need to have it in order to move the plot forwards. But at the same time, it makes you understand these characters even more.
Yeah, the script, I think it was something Hal Hartley worked on for a while. Like, I think it was like, a script that it was almost like his own little personal opus, like the way that Henry has his own like masterpiece that he's working on over this period of years. So you can tell it's something he put a lot of thought into, and he worked on it really hard, and he was getting it like, apparently it evolved over time. Like, originally it focused more on Simon, but then over time it started to focus more on Henry as he took more of an outsized role. And yeah, like Henry himself as a character, he has such an impact when he comes into this community, this neighborhood, and some of it is negative, some of it is positive. Like, for all of Henry's flaws, he represents like a certain kind of energy and a certain kind of honesty in a way beneath all of his arrogance and all of his bravado. And that's sort of the impact he has on Simon. And Simon is, like I said, he's immediately taken with him. And maybe that has to do with the fact that Simon is, he's this very closed off and, socially awkward guy, like I said. So the fact that Henry is so confident and boisterous, like, Simon is sort of drawn to that. Like, he can't help but be sort of pulled in. And yeah, it's that sense of honesty that he imparts upon Simon, where he tells him, like, if you have something in your head, just write it down. Like, he even gives him a blank notebook. And that's kind of what starts this off, where Simon just sits down and starts writing, and it starts pouring out of him. And that's where the kind of complications begin to occur. And in terms of like this film as a movie about writing and writers, like, I think it's probably one of the best I've ever seen. Like, I'm an aspiring writer myself. Like, I'm working on novels and stuff. Like, it's something I've done for a long time now. So I really appreciate that particular aspect of it. And like, you can tell that it's something that Hal Hartley was interested in exploring. He even said that the relationship between Henry and Simon was kind of inspired by the real life relationship between James Joyce and Samuel Beckett, who were these two Irish authors. So there's kind of like, a certain literary thing, but at the same time, the movie has like an energy to it, and there's also like a lot of like scatological humor, like, vomit scenes, like shitting scenes. Like, the movie doesn't take itself too seriously, even though it's dealing with, like Henry being this pretentious sort of, wannabe literate guy. Like, the movie has a bit more of a sense of humor than that, and yeah, it can balance these tones where it's really dark and really serious, but then something like really goofy and weird will happen. Like, most notably the scene where Henry finds out that he's gotten Simon's sister pregnant, and he ends up just having this insane attack of diarrhea on the toilet, and then immediately after she like it's like a marriage proposal scene where it's so hilarious
Oh
and
my
so
God.
like tonally weird, but it's done in a way where it's like Hal Hartley makes it work. Like, yeah, he's really good at balancing these tones, and like it's done in a way where it's so like he just let the movie be what it was. He didn't try to like push it too far in a
Exactly.
certain way.
Exactly.
And yeah, like the whole writing aspect of the film, like you mentioned this, like we find out that Simon, he begins to develop as a writer, and he's writing this kind of epic poem, and we're never shown what it is. We never actually find out what it is. We're not read like parts of it. Like it, we just see how people react to it, and it has very visceral reactions to like everyone. For one thing, the daughter of Mr. Deng, the guy who owns the coffee shop, she was like mute, and when she reads his poetry, she spontaneously starts singing. Simon's sister, when she's typing up the poem, she mentions that she started her period like a week early. So it's not only, and people are like disgusted by it and provoked by it, but it's also having like physical reactions on the people around him. So it's almost like, like I always pictured like Simon's writing to maybe be like Charles Bukowski or something, like, this really kind of gutter poetry. And obviously it's a reflection of like, his life. He's living in this kind of dead-end neighborhood surrounded by like, violence and punks and degradation and, weird sex. So all of these things are kind of reflected in his own writing. And yeah, like, and that, like the writing and how Simon begins to kind of grow like a little cult following around himself. And, people have all of these really, some people are like, oh, it's so experimental and, you're shining a light onto society and all that. And they come up with all of these like pretentious sort of like ways of interpreting Simon's writing. But I don't think Simon sees it that way. He just sees it more as like an honest expression. Like, he even tells Henry, like, you just told me to write poetry, so I wrote. And it starts to sort of complicate his relationship with Henry as well, because, the whole... It's weird because Simon begins to sort of achieve what Henry wanted. He starts to become the celebrated writer. He starts to be the one that everybody recognizes, but at the same time, Henry doesn't necessarily become jealous over it. Like, he continues to nurture and encourage Simon, which is that's another one of the things that sort of makes Henry into a bit more of a likable character. He is genuinely supportive of Simon, not just like reading his work, but also correcting it and, giving him like crash courses on, writing and the specifics of it. And he even, like Simon is not very sure of himself, but Henry basically fires him up and tells him like, no, you have to believe that this is like a world-changing piece of literature. You have to believe that in your heart. You have to believe your own poetry. And, that's what really pushes him to do it. So there's this kind of thing where Simon begins to become a success, but he's sort of inextricably bound to Henry in a way. And yeah, it leads to this weird almost like codependency between them. And, like the whole concept of friendship and, inspiration and what you may potentially owe to a person and, loyalty and things like that. And yeah, Simon comes to a point where he has the opportunity to really publish his work and make an impact, and not only that, reap a substantial financial reward as well. But he feels, by this point, Henry's life has kind of started falling apart more and more. He's, he isn't writing very much. He's becoming more and more of an alcoholic. He's also gotten Henry's sister, he's also gotten Simon's sister pregnant. He was having sexual relations with her, and now he's in this position where he feels like he needs to marry Simon's sister, and his whole kind of world is falling apart. He fancied himself as this kind of, guy who could go around like, a bohemian, a writer, like a man who could, but now he's falling into this kind of predictable life, married life, fatherhood, normal job. That's the thing that he was always terrified of. So now with Simon about to really make a name for himself, he sees that as kind of his last chance, and he encourages Simon to present his own work to the publisher and, do you want to publish this as well? And Simon feels so indebted to Henry that he even tells him, like, yeah, I'll get him to publish your work. I'll even tell him that if he doesn't publish your work, I won't let him publish my work. So, he kind of goes to bat for Henry. But then he actually reads Henry's work, and he's confronted with the horrible truth that Henry is not a good writer. Henry, for all of his talk and all of his inspiration and all of his knowledge, he can't translate that into actual compelling writing. So Simon, to his credit, he does attempt to push it. He attempts to convince the publisher, but it's just a no-go, and that's kind of where things fall apart. Like their relationship sort of comes to a head, and they have a bit of a confrontation. But again, the thing I like about it is it's not done in the predictable way. Like it's not. They don't have like a fist fight. It's not like a super emotional thing. Like they're sort of both cutting to each other. And they're both kind of dealing harsh truths to each other. Like Simon tells Henry, I wrote, I did it. You were messing around doing whatever. I actually sat down and did the work. What do you want me to tell you? And Henry comes back with like, yeah, but you never would have done it without me. Like, you never would have even had the balls to put it out there. And even at a certain point, Simon became discouraged in his own work, and Henry encouraged Faye, Simon's sister, to put it out on the internet. And that's what really got him attention. So again, there is like an argument to be made here that without Henry, he never would have gotten anywhere.
See, that's what I love about this film, because as you're watching it and understanding characters' motivations, that's the whole point of it. It's the motivations behind it, right? Some guy who's in the slums working as a trash man gets one shot to like a lot of money and actual getting royalties back in the 90s. That's a lot of money,
yeah,
right?
Like your whole life changing,
exactly.
Essentially. Yeah.
And yes, for Henry, everything's falling apart. He had those aspirations, but the more you find out the truths about his character, like for one, saying that, yes, I'm good friends with the publisher, maybe I could get a word for you. And then you find out later on that was kind of like,
a lie.
It was a pseudo lie, because yes, he did know the publisher, but not it was under false pretenses and whatever. So that's what makes it that you're always drawn into whatever camp you're going to get into, but it makes you have that conversation of like, who was right in that scene? And to have something that real and being able to have good plausible defense and good plausible prosecution against both characters of saying like, is this guy a dirtbag or is this guy a dirtbag?
Yeah.
That's how you make good storytelling with good
characters.
Like
he doesn't like push it in either direction too much. It's not so much a point of like he's right or he's wrong. Mm-hmm. They both sort of make good points. And it's a good scene too, because like for one thing, Henry, even though he's clearly very disappointed and very crushed by, the fact that his work has been rejected. Mm-hmm. And, at one point he even asked Simon, like, what about you? What did you think of it? Like Simon is sort of cowardly in a sense because he just couldn't come out and tell Henry right from the beginning that your writing is bad. Yeah. Like he could have told him, he could have been honest with him. Mm-hmm. And yeah, like and Henry, to his credit, he doesn't hold a grudge. Like he even tells Simon, like, I'm not going to hold a grudge against you. Like you can tell he understands on some level, like this is a life-changing opportunity. He can't turn it down,
Yeah.
And even later on, he continues to defend Simon's writing, like, continues to defend him, his validity as a writer. But yeah, it's kind of that moment where their paths inextricably diverge, like Simon is clearly going in a different direction and Henry is, now this is his life. He's a father, he's a husband, he's working that he's got the job as the garbage man. So like it's almost like there's been a transference there, and the movie could well have ended right there. He could have just ended at that point, but instead he sort of extends it into this epilogue. And it's fascinating because we get kind of a glimpse into the future down the line. Now we see Henry is the father, his child is a bit older, and, his relationship with Faye is obviously not doing too well. He's not a great dad. He's sort of fallen on the skids, personally, professionally. But it's an interesting segment because, in a way, it's sort of like, I don't know if you would come so far as to call it like a redemption for Henry, but it's where he he's confronted with a moral situation. A moral situation arises, and Henry is put into this situation where he has to defend someone who is in a terrible, terrible situation. And it's fascinating on so many levels because, like I mentioned earlier, Henry is not necessarily an innocent himself. You know, he's done something very bad in his own past. Yeah, there's like this idea that Henry, like, again, I don't want to say so much it's like, you know, oh, he's redeeming himself for what he did in the past, but it's kind of showing that he's not completely a lost cause as a person. Like, there's almost like a clear differentiation between him and this other character who is depicted as being much more monstrous.
Yeah.
And yeah, that ends up sort of leading to the unlikely reunion of Henry and Simon, their lives crossing paths again. And it leads to a really kind of touching and somewhat ambiguous ending. And, you know, we're not going to say too much about it, but it's a really kind of beautiful ending. And I love that the film, it has this real sense of, like, history to it in a way. Or, like, even though it's only, like, 2 hours, 15 minutes long or so, it almost feels like an epic in a sense of, like, you're really seeing this prolonged period in the lives of these characters and how they change and how things sort of develop for them and their relationships. Like, it's a really great film. Like, just the idea of you take a movie that on the surface seems somewhat simple, and even, like, you know, it is very much dark comedy. Like, there's a lot of dark humor in the film, like, you know, poop jokes, things like that. But it's still able to pull off this really thought-provoking and really kind of emotionally challenging story, putting these characters in these kind of circumstances. And yeah, that's a really difficult thing to pull off, and it's really not the kind of thing you can pull off in mainstream Hollywood. Like, if he would have presented this to a mainstream studio, that, you know, they would have said, nah, like, you know, the first thing they would have demanded is they would have had, you know, take out Henry being a sex offender. Like, that in and of itself is like a difficult thing to sell to an audience. Like, having this character still be somewhat relatable or likable enough as, like, one of the main characters having done something so, you know, bad.
Mm-hmm.
And just the weird kind of tone of the movie and what they were going for. Like, yeah, they would have demanded too many compromises. So the film kind of emerges as this really unique and, like, just, to me, it's like the perfect kind of movie where it's a unique sort of vision. It's not trying too hard to pander towards, like, a particular market. It's just, you know, this is what it is, and it's sort of unapologetic about what it's trying to do.
See, with this film and the character arcs that each character goes through, that's the type of story that I like, because there's a thing about movies back in the 90s. Yes, movies still have it nowadays, but it was very prevalent where there was always a moral point to most stories, and this one had a clear moral point, even if it ended in ambiguity, especially with the character of Henry, where the character arc that he goes through, I was kind of like, even at the end, I was kind of like a little bit rooting for him, because I understood that there's a line that's said in the beginning or close to the beginning of the film where I want to change. And that's kind of like one of the themes of this film. It's like change, you know? Change into good, change into bad, you don't know, but life will kind of dictate, and your experiences through it, kind of like Henry being the experienced one, like we said, and Simon being the inexperienced one. And then you get to a time skip, basically, and we get to see what experience does to a person. On a small level, of course, but in a way where it's like, it's nice, it's completed, and you get why things are happening. It doesn't feel like an ass pull of like, oh, why did this happen and why did that happen? You're like, okay, no, that makes sense.
Yeah, like, he does a good job at layering a consistent narrative. Like, even though a lot of your focus is obviously going to be mostly on Henry and Simon and Faye, the characters are, like I said, they're evolving in the background and things are happening. And yeah, he's sort of building this up. Like, that's why in some ways I see it as a bit like a story of a community, and like it also depicts like a particular era where things were changing. Like, you know, like I mentioned, there's those discussions of, you know, the internet is going to come change everything. Like, we see these guys talking to the publisher about that, and just, yeah, capturing this kind of evolving moment in the national consciousness. And it's just a really funny and heartfelt and strange movie. Like, it's definitely not the kind of movie you're gonna see every day, and it's, I loved it. I was really, like, I'd heard about it before, but I didn't sit down to really watch it until recently. And it's been a while since a movie's really sort of taken me aback. Like, I watch so many movies, you fall into like almost patterns, and you relate them to other movies and you group them together into genres and stuff like that. And but for a movie like this, it's really kind of unique and bold in its approach. And it's a movie that even today I feel still has a lot of power.
One thing before we close out, one thing I really like, this is my own interpretation for it, but we never get to see what the fuck the poem is or what it's about, but I believe that the film itself is a loose interpretation of what the poem is about. Because they define the poem as pornographic, scatolicious, or
Scatolicious.
Scatological, and basically perverse and very in-your-face type of story. And this movie kind of just is a movie that's kind of like in your face. It's not every day that you get to see a man propose to his wife while he's taking his shit in a tub.
Yes.
While she's taking a shower in there. So it's like, okay, maybe, that's what the poem is all about type of thing. But again, that's to each view.
Yeah, you get like a sense of it. Like the movie sort of reflects, with the, like, it's really brilliant in that way, and you don't really need to see the poem. Like, the movie kind of works better without actually showing us what Simon's poem is, giving us, we're always left wondering, and this kind of outsized effect it has on everyone around him. And like, it's not a movie about writing, it's a movie about writers, in that sense. So I think it really works. And like, in some ways it almost reminds me of like Amadeus a little bit, like just the idea of having like this rivalry between two, like, creative driven guys, but not really in the same way. Like, Henry and Simon are not so much rivals, although, they're at a certain point their relationship definitely does get prickly in that way, with Simon being the more successful one. But just this idea of like the sort of creative energy between these two guys and their weird particular relationship, but also like there is like an element of heartfelt friendship in there despite everything. Like, Henry, the bastard that he is, he does have an undeniably positive effect on Simon's life, not just encouraging him as a writer, but just encouraging him as a person, getting him out of, like, at one point Simon even says flat out to him, like, you saved my life. So you understand why Simon is so loyal to Henry and why he still tries for him. So, it's a movie that's satisfying on a lot of different levels. And, like, I think it's a movie that deserves to be more widely seen.
My rating for this film... Oof, this is difficult. Look, this is a really great film. On its merits, I'm going to give it 4.5 out of 5. That's what I'm going to give it.
I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to give it 5 out of 5 because I really love it. And like, it might not be a perfect movie in the eyes of a lot of people, but for me, it's a movie that just accomplishes exactly what it set out to do. It's unique, and it's a movie that appeals to me on like a personal level. Like, again, the writing, the creativity, things like that. So this is a movie I really enjoyed. It really kind of got under my skin in a positive way. And like, I love it, but I also sort of mourn like the passing of that era of cinema. Like, there's still independent films, but I don't know, we've sort of lost a certain spirit and a certain adventurousness, you could say. So it's great to see a movie like this that sort of reminds you of that, of what you can really accomplish outside the conventional studio system.
And not just as a writer, but even as an artist, this movie speaks on so many levels of just like how it is to be a starving artist, how it is to see the world so differently from other people. But if you know how that feels, or if you've seen this film, let us know down in the comments what you think about it. Until then, it's been Film on High.
Peace.
Later.